Okay, tonight we're going to go through Acts 23 through 25, and these are continuing the trials of Paul. And last time he had trials by the Sanhedrin, and now he's going to have it by two different uh, Roman courts. And anyway, it's kind of a lot like Jesus, what he had to go through, and they have about as much evidence against Paul as they did against Jesus. They just didn't have any. So, chapter 23 emphasized God's sovereign protection of Paul and the fulfillment of his purpose for Paul to reach Rome. So, this was all part of God's plan, and his plan was working out. And God promised Paul that he's going to Rome, and so Paul doesn't really have to worry about all these things, and because he's got God's promise, and he promised that last time, he's going to promise that again to him tonight. In verse 23, Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. And so, anyway, then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." In their law, you were basically the same as our law. You're not guilty until proven guilty. And so punishing him before he was found guilty was violating their law, is what he's saying. He's whitewashed wall. That's like you look good on the outside, but you're dirty on the inside. And those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brother, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" And so, anyway, uh, there's some question about why he didn't know it was a high priest. And some say in Galatians, Paul says he had bad eyes, and maybe that was it. He had bad eyes, but I think maybe he didn't think he was a high priest because he's violating God's law, and no high priest would violate the law. But he doesn't say anything bad about him. He said, "I'm sorry," basically, and I shouldn't have done that. But I think he was justified. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and other Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I'm a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." And this was pretty brilliant. And the whole idea I think he had in mind was to divide these people. And so a divided kingdom will fall. And so he brought up the uh, resurrection of the dead. And when he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. I think that was his plan. And the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believed all these things. And so they had them divided, and the Sadducees, they don't think there's an afterlife, so they're sad, you see. And anyway, there was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man." They said, "What if a spirit or angel had spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. In summary of 1 through 10, Paul asserts he had lived a good conscience, and so he was uh, doing what he thought he should do. And the high priest Ananias orders him struck, prompting Paul to call him a whitewashed wall, a prophecy later fulfilled when Ananias was assassinated. Paul strategically divided the council by highlighting the resurrection of the dead, pitting the Pharisees against the Sadducees. The following night, the Lord stood before Paul and said, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." And this is a promise again that he's going to make it to Rome. Amidst the crisis, the Lord appears to Paul, assuring him that he will bear witness in Rome just as he did in Jerusalem. Next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they killed Paul. Well, if you don't drink, you're only going to last 3, maybe 4 days. But they made this oath. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul." So this was like their whole purpose in life, was to kill Paul, the most important thing that they could do for their cause, I guess. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here. But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting to ambush him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." So he doesn't want them tipped off about what's going to happen. He knows, and he's going to work on it. Over 40 Jews vows not to eat or drink until they kill Paul. Paul's nephew overhears the plot and informs the Roman commander, Claudius Lysias. Then he called 2 of his centurions, ordered them. Centurion is somebody who's over 100 men. "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul, so he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He wrote a letter as followed: Claudius Lysias to his Excellency Governor Felix, greeting. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he was a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusations had to be with questions about the law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. Also, I ordered his accusers to present to you their cases against him. So the soldiers, carrying out the orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antiparas. And the next day they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from, learning he was from Cilicia. He said, I will hear your case when your accusers get here. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. To ensure Paul's safety, Lysias sent him under heavy military guard, 470 soldiers, to Governor Felix in Caesarea. Lystra sent a letter stating Paul is innocent of Roman law and only accused of Jewish theological disputes. Analysis and key themes in this chapter 25. The conscience. Paul's claim of good conscience refers to externals of his life and his blamelessness under the law rather than a claim of sinlessness. Roman justice versus Jewish hostility. A major apologetic theme in Acts is that Roman officials like Lystra, Felix, and Gallio consistently found Paul innocent of civil crimes. This demonstrates that Christianity was not a threat to the Roman state. Sovereign protection, the massive military escort, and the rescue by Roman authority as God's method of preserving Paul's life to fulfill his mission to Rome. The whitewash wall, the term used by Paul, indicates hypocrisy and outward appearance of justice that mask an inward corruption. Chapter 24, focusing on the legal proceedings between the Apostle Paul and Roman Governor Felix. 5 days after the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea. Actually, it's up to Caesarea, but because it's north of there, if you've ever been there. But Jerusalem's the highest spot in all of Israel, so they always say you go down or up to Jerusalem. And he went there with some elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. So Tertullus is a Greek name. He is a Greek lawyer that they found and brought him along, hopefully presenting the charges a little better. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. So he's complimenting him first of all. Everywhere and every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. So he starts off with this great compliment to try to get on his good side. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, and that's kind of an outsider sect, and he even tried to desecrate the temple, so we seized him. We know he didn't do that. That was a false charge that he brought a Gentile into there. They didn't see him with a Gentile in there. They saw him outside with a Gentile, but he didn't take him inside, but they accused him of that anyway. And he stirred up riots all over the world. The Jews that were mad at him came to where he was and stirred up a riot. He didn't stir up these riots. They're all false charges, and by examining him yourself, you'll be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him." The other Jews joined in their accusation, asserting that these things were true. 1 through 5. 5 days after Paul's arrival, the high priest Ananias and a lawyer named Tertullus arrived to present their case. Tertullus levels three main charges. Personal, political. Paul was a pest and troublemaker, stirring up Jews throughout the Roman Empire. Religious, he was a leader of a sect of the Nazarenes, which the Jews viewed as a cult outside mainstream Judaism. They accused Jesus of being a Nazarene too. Specific, he attempted to profane the temple. Once again, bringing a Gentile in there, but he didn't. 10. Then the governor motioned for him to speak. Paul replied, "I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone in the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogue or anywhere else in the city. They cannot prove to you that the charges they are making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets." So he thinks he has reached a logical conclusion in becoming a follower of the way as a Jewish person, based on what the law and the prophets all point to the truthfulness of Jesus as the Messiah and Redeemer. "And I have the same hope in God as the men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked." And so both of them are going to be resurrected. "So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my gifts for the poor and present offerings. I was ceremonially cleaned when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me." So these are the ones that brought all the riots against him when he was in Asia. "Or these who are here should state that crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless I was this one thing. I shouted as I stood there in the present, it is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today." So that's the one thing that got him all upset. And that's the only wrong thing he might have done, but that's one of the reasons he was there. Paul rebutted these charges by noting that he had only been in Jerusalem for 12 days and was not inciting any riots. He confessed to be a follower of the way, but argued it was fully consistent with the law and the prophets. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lystra, the commander, comes, he said, "I will decide your case." He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him and spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. So Felix he was a former slave, and he was kind of an immoral, corrupt guy, and somehow he got to be a governor. And so, anyway, Felix is now going to talk with him a little bit. And I wonder, one thing I wonder, if you ever been to Caesarea, it's right on the coast. And it's really a kind of a pretty sight. And I hope Paul had a room with a view of the ocean, or else maybe he let him walk out on the beach once in a while with his friends or something like that. And I hope it was a good time for Paul there, and it wasn't like being in prison so much. Sounds like he might have special rights. And as Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you." So what did Paul talk about? He talked about the judgment to come, that you're going to be judged for what you do in this lifetime. And Felix, he likes the dark. He doesn't want to think about the light coming on him and all that he's done in his immorality and corruption. So he said, "That's enough of that. I don't want any more of that." At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. So he was probably getting kickbacks from the Jews, so he decided to leave him in there just because of the Jews. But Paul was able to talk to a lot of folks and counsel a lot of folks and do a lot of things while he was in the jail there for 2 years. Probably people came up from Jerusalem and came down from Asia, and he probably got a lot done while he was in there. So 22 to 27, Felix was already well informed about Christianity, delayed the verdict until the pretext of the waiting Lyrsa for the commander. He kept Paul in the house arrest for 2 years, occasionally listening to him speak about faith, righteousness, and judgment, while secretly hoping for a bribe. The central issue for Paul was the resurrection of the dead, and it's a central issue for us. If Christ didn't rise from the dead, our faith is useless. And the whole book of Acts is evidence of Christ rising from the dead. And by emphasizing this, Paul forced Felix to deal with a theological dispute between Jewish factions rather than a criminal political matter. Character of Felix. The text portrays Felix as an indecisive, selfish leader. Felix was alarmed by Paul's message on judgment, but remained motivated by political favors and financial gain, eventually leaving Paul in prison to please the Jews. Apologetic purpose. In the broader context of Acts, that Luke included these trials to show that the Roman officials did not find Christianity to be a threat to the state or a violation of Roman law. Paul's demeanor. Paul spoke with vigor and force, but without self-pity or bitterness, despite being cruelly misrepresented. And so he didn't get mad about it. He was cool. He was like Jesus. He was always cool in all his trials too. Chapter 25, the last chapter. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. So this is a recap for the new leader, Festus, and they're going to go through the same thing again. They requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. I don't think it was with the 40 people who were still fasting. They were dead a long time ago, but maybe they started eating and they wanted a second chance. But Festus answered, "Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon, Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. The transition of power. 3 days after Porcius Festus takes office in Caesarea, he visits Jerusalem. The Jewish leaders immediately pressure him to bring Paul to Jerusalem for trial, intending to ambush him and kill him en route. Festus refuses, insisting that the trial take place in Caesarea. After spending 8 or 10 days with him, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convinced the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. Then Paul came in, and the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Then Paul made as his defense, I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know well. If, however, I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has a right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. And so he brought this up as a Jew. If you appeal to Caesar, then they got to let you go to Caesar. It's like appealing to the Supreme Court or something like that. And after Festus had confirmed with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you must go. So he doesn't have to go to Jerusalem. This is all part of God's plan. The trial before Festus. In Caesarea, Paul faces unprovable charges regarding Jewish law and the temple. To gain favor with the Jews, Festus asks Paul if he's willing to be tried in Jerusalem. Paul, recognizing the danger and asserting his rights as a Roman citizen, officially appealed to Caesar. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respect to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, there's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they face their accusers and have an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the men to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. And that's not a capital crime. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to him, Festus, I would like to hear this man myself, he replied. Tomorrow you will hear him. Agrippa and Bernice visit. King Agrippa and his sister Bernice arrive to greet the new governor. Festus presents Paul's case to them, expressing confusion because the accusations were religious dispute rather than criminal acts. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with you, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem, here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought to not live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he was made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I have brought him before you, all of you, especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it's unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. And so, anyway, King Agrippa, and I think it was predicted that his disciples would appear before kings and royalty and other things, and this is being fulfilled right now. The hearing preparations. Festus organized a public hearing before Agrippa, the military commanders, the city prominent men. He admits he has no specific charges to write to the emperor, and hopes Agrippa expertise will help him formulate a report. Analysis. Characteristic of governors. While Felix was generally more competent than Festus was more competent than Felix, he still prioritized political favor over justice. Both governors were complex characters who were unwilling to release Paul despite his innocence for fear of offending the Jewish high priests. Apologetic themes. Luke included these details to show that the Roman providential government officials and the Jewish king Agrippa eventually acknowledged Paul's innocence. This served as an apologetic purpose for the early church, demonstrating that it was not a threat to the Roman state. So Paul was the big leader of this movement in the Jewish sector, and he was brought up and they had no charges against him. Divine providence. The appeal to Caesar is analyzed as the right of every Roman citizen, and means by which God promised for Paul to testify in Rome was fulfilled. Paul was caught in a web of self-interested maneuvers, but remained faithful witness rather than a helpless victim. Comparison to Jesus' trial. There is a parallel between Paul's legal battles and those of Jesus, noting both stood before two Roman officials, Pilate and Herod for Jesus, Felix and Festus, Agrippa for Paul. So his testimony is going to be picked up in chapter 26, and we probably could have done it tonight, but we got to have 3 chapters for next week. So anyway, this was the trials, and it's nothing earth-shattering, and I think it's a very important part of the story.